Alright, before we start learning about the early colonies in American history, we first have to learn about the true first Americans to our great continent. Obviously, these were the Native Americans. You guys have probably heard of Native Americans before, but it's going to be really important to understand that they occupied our continent before Europeans or any other outside influence came to this area. Okay, this image shows the true America. This is an America with no political divisions, no states, nothing. Probably not a map that we're used to. That just shows the continent and the physical features. But this is the continent, and this is the map that Native Americans truly understood. As you can see, our continent has a lot of varieties of physical features, and the Native Americans adapted to those physical features. Those physical features created their lifestyle, what food they ate, how they lived their life, what religious beliefs they had. These were all shaped by the physical features that our continent gave them. When learning about the first Americans, it's really important to understand that today scientists are still trying to find out more about these Native Americans. These early people left very, very few written records or journals. So researchers and historians and scientists, they have to study other items that they left behind. Not much has survived history except a few animal and human bones, some stone and metal tools, and bits of pottery as well. These scientists are like detectives as they sift through these clues, trying to imagine how these people lived and how their lives changed over time. The scientists come up with ideas about the many ways in which American Indians adapted to the physical surroundings. When scientists find a new object, they try to figure out whether it supports their current ideas about how Native Americans lived, or if it suggests new ideas about how they lived. In your lifetime, we will probably learn much more about how the first Americans adapted to the environments, and maybe even history will be rewritten. Here pictured are some artifacts that scientists use to try to determine the way of life. These two pictures represent artifacts from the Anasazi tribe in the Southwest Territory of the United States. Okay, right here you can see that the Anasazi Indians of the Southwestern Territory of the U.S., they made pottery. And this is actually a pitcher that they used, and they made this from clay and other materials. Okay, here in the bottom right, you can see that the Anasazi Indians adapted to their environment by building homes in stone cliffs that the territory in the Southwest offered them. The question we have to ask is, how did these first Americans even get to our continent? You guys have probably seen a map of North America before, and you know that it's split by oceans. Our country is protected by oceans. So how did these people get here? Well, I'll tell you that it was not by boat. Scientists actually believe that these first Americans migrated, which means they moved from one place to another, on foot from Siberia, which is in Asia, to present-day Alaska. They did this by crossing what was called a land bridge. And about 30,000 years ago, there was an ice age on Earth. And the temperatures got so cold that the ocean in that part between Asia and Alaska actually froze over. And this allowed the first Americans to cross over to our new continent. Now, they didn't just cross over because they were curious about what this continent looked like, or because there was a new land bridge there. They crossed for survival reasons. Okay, they crossed in order to follow food. There was large Asian mammals, including mammoths, that crossed this land bridge just because they were doing what animals were doing. And so these people, the first Americans, followed these animals in order to survive and have food for their tribes. And they continued following these animals all the way throughout the eastern part of our continent, the southern part of our continent, and that's what kept them pushing down and even into South America. Here is a map of kind of what I mean by this migration. So these first Americans were located in Siberia region, which is actually present-day Russia. And this area right here was frozen over because of the Ice Age and the really cool temperatures. Okay, here they crossed this land bridge and they came into present-day Alaska, which is right here. And then they kept, over the years, over those 30,000 years, they kept following those animals into different territories until they finally settled in one area that they knew that their people could survive. In learning about the migration of the first Americans, it's also important to understand how the first Americans adapted to the environment of the North American continent. Well, the first Americans, they survived by being able to adapt to the physical features the continent offered, the climate that the continent offered, as well as the natural resources that was offered by the continent of North America. These people broke off into different cultural regions and tribes based on where their food source took them. Their food source took them to the southern parts of the continent, to the eastern parts, to the western parts, but eventually their tribe or cultural region found an area that they could settle and in which they were suited by all of their needs. In understanding a cultural region, this is an area that consists of people that share a similar language and way of life. Language was very, very important in the first Americans, and there was very many different types of languages that these Native Americans spoke. There was not one that was similar. The most important way of determining what their way of life was to find out what their food source is. For example, if their food source was a buffalo, we know that these tribes would move from place to place following their food source. This map here indicates what I mean by a cultural region. As you can see, the different colors represent the different regions that the first Americans migrated to and eventually settled. So, the different cultural regions are going to have very different languages and very different way of life. For example, the subarctic area right here is going to have a different way of life, a different food source, a different language than the southwest cultural region because of the physical features that are different in that area, but also the natural resources and definitely the climate. Okay, you're going to have a lot more hot weather in the southwest compared to cooler in the subarctic regions. Overall, this is very, very important to understand because regions, they still define our country today and the way of life that people have living in a different region of the United States. Also, it's going to be really important to understand these first Americans and Native Americans overall because they play a major role in U.S. history. We're going to continually learn about these people throughout the year, and they shape a lot of what America looks like today.